Good afternoon or good morning, depending upon what part of the country you're in. I'm Lawrence Van Dyke, and I'm privileged to get to moderate today's panel on presented by the Environment and Property Rights Practice Group. And our panel this morning or this afternoon is the EPA Turns 50, a debate on environmental progress and regulatory overreach. And I've got a fantastic group of panelists that are going to talk to you and talk to each other, and we'll see if we can get some debate, since that's in the name of our title here. I'm going to talk a little bit about our four panelists. The first one to speak this morning is Susan Bodine, and Susan is the Assistant Administrator at the EPA's Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, and this is her second time that she's been at the EPA. Before that, she was the Assistant Administrator for the Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response, which is now the Office of Land and Emergency Management. And prior to her current position, she served as the Chief Counsel for the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, and she previously worked for the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. And Susan's going to talk to us today about the accomplishments of the EPA and its history and its change over time, which I think, given the number that she's been back and forth there, she's well positioned to talk about. A fun fact about Susan is that she has basically done everything twice in her career. She was in private practice twice, she worked on the Hill twice, and she's at the EPA twice. She asked us to give her double the time given that for this morning, but we said no, she's still got to stick with her time. So Susan's going to go first, but before she starts, I'm going to introduce the rest of the panelists. Our second panelist this morning, or this afternoon, will be Lisa Heinzerling. And Professor Heinzling is a professor at Georgetown University Law Center, where she specializes in administrative and environmental law. And she's authored several books, including Priceless, on Knowing the Price of Everything and the Value of Nothing, which is a critique of the cost-benefit analysis in environmental policy. And Lisa previously served as Senior Climate Policy Counselor to the Administrator of the EPA and Associate Administrator of EPA's Office of Policy. And she's going to talk today primarily about climate change, but given that we just had an election, she's going to talk about how she thinks the new administration could influence EPA's policy. A fun fact about Lisa is that she loves heist movies. So she asked if she could steal Susan's time. I told her no, she can't steal Susan's time. So you see, hopefully we'll get like a nice debate here going, given all the tension we already have. Our next presenter will be Scott Fulton. Scott is currently the president of the Environmental Law Institute, and he's the former general counsel at the EPA. Mr. Fulton has served in a number of other key leadership roles in both Republican and Democrat administrations, including as the acting EPA deputy administrator, the head of EPA's Office of International Affairs, a judge on the Environmental Appeals Board, and head of the agency's enforcement program. He also served as Assistant Chief of the Environmental Enforcement Section at the U.S. Department of Justice in the Environment and Natural Resources Division. Scott's going to talk about today, he's going to talk about during his time the Macbeth Report, cooperative federalism, and having a more robust federal role in environmental protection. Fun fact about Scott is that he is a singer-songwriter, and he's made many albums. And he told me that, and I thought, oh yeah, sure. And I looked him up, and it's actually true. He has. And my clerks were forced to listen to me playing Scott's songs for a while, very loud. He's best known for his acoustic folk compositions. Look up Scott Fulton and his music, and but after this panel, do that. And then our last but not least speaker is Henry, who goes by Hank Havoc, and he's currently the principal at Global Water 2020. His career in the environmental policy world has included leadership positions at the U.S. EPA as the COO. He's held numerous board seats over the years, including serving as managing director of the U.S. Water Partnership, chairman of the board of Water Health International, co-founder of the American Council on Renewable Energy, and a member of the board on the Global Water Challenge. He served as the commissioner of the National Commission on Energy Policy, and he's advised several cabinet secretaries. And he's going to talk about separation of powers at DOJ, EPA, and congressional issues. And a fun fact, which shouldn't be too surprising given as much water stuff as he's worked on, is he's helping to launch a platform that will help smaller communities fund their water infrastructure. So with that, we're going to start with Susan. She's going to speak, each of the panelists are going to speak for 7 minutes. And then once they're done, we'll have a little bit of back and forth, hopefully get some debate or at least some dialogue. And then we'll open this up for questions, which we'll have more on later. Susan, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, Judge. America's a much different place and a much cleaner place now than it was in 1970. And that's because of EPA. Our air is breathable, our water is drinkable, and waste is managed and cleaned up. As a country, we have accomplished this without stopping economic growth because Congress designed our environmental statutes to allow EPA to set national standards and then to authorize EPA or authorized states to issue permits that ensure that those standards are met. This approach is market and technology neutral. Our statutes address protection of human health and the environment, not market design or social engineering. When EPA ignores its statutory limitations and its statutory responsibilities, American communities can suffer. On September 7th of this year, Politico reported that Lois Gibbs, who was the original Superfund community activist, said the following about the former EPA Administrator, Gina McCarthy, and I quote, "All she cared about was climate. Everything else went to blank in a handbasket, whether it was water or environmental justice," close quote. In the same article, Lois credited the Trump EPA with decisive action to advance Superfund cleanups that had been languishing and to hold responsible parties accountable. That's just one example of how in the past 4 years, EPA has made it a priority to get results for American communities. But to do that, we actually had to overcome an enormous backlog of unfinished business. For example, the Superfund process does create a stigma that suppresses property values and investment. But in 4 years, EPA will have partially or fully delisted at least 82 Superfund sites, freeing communities from that stigma. 4 years ago, there was a backlog of 700 Clean Air Act state implementation plans, waiting for EPA approval, stalling the environmental work to reduce air pollution, hurting communities. We've reduced that backlog to just 200 SIPs. We've nearly eliminated the backlog of EPA inaction on state lists of impaired waters and have acted on more than 7,000 TMDLs, which are total maximum daily loads, that are plans that are needed to restore polluted waters. In the past 4 years, EPA has helped finance $40 billion in investments for water infrastructure, in large part because in 2017, we stood up the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act program, which is a fantastic tool that Congress authorized in 2014, but had not been used previously. Last week's election did not indicate a mandate to radically change the direction of EPA. For example, after former Vice President Biden said during the debates that he wants to transition away from oil, the Pittsburgh Gazette endorsed President Trump, the first Republican endorsement since 1972. After the current head of the California Air Resources Board, Mary Nichols, told Inside EPA that she thought a Biden administration should use California fuel policies as a template, and Democrat members of Congress introduced legislation to, like California, ban all gasoline vehicles by 2035. The Renewable Fuels Association hit back, Iowa went for President Trump, and Senator Ernst won re-election. You can be sure that environmental practitioners here in DC, as well as congressional staff on oversight committees, all kept copies of those remarks because, in terms of authority, only the Renewable Fuel Standard Program, which would become irrelevant, of course, if there's a switch to no-fuel cars, authorizes EPA to give a market share to a particular fuel. I don't think the courts are going to allow the next administration to exceed their statutory authority to regulate. I think we can all remember back in 2015 when the former EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy appeared on the Bill Maher show on the Friday before the Supreme Court ruled on the mercury and air toxics case. She told the public it didn't matter if the rule was legally valid because it was issued 3 years ago, investments had been made, most facilities were already in compliance, quote, so we're still going to get that at the toxic pollution from those facilities, close quote. even if the rule was illegal. A copy of an EPA blog repeating those remarks was in the filings seeking a stay of the Clean Power Plan, and for the first time ever, the Supreme Court stayed a rule before the Circuit Court had acted. EPA can stay within the law and still obtain greenhouse gas reductions. We just announced today that greenhouse gas emissions from large stationary sources declined by nearly 5% from 2018 to 2019. Under the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, by 2030, carbon emissions from the power sector will go down by 34%. Since 2017, air pollution in the US has fallen by 7%. I also don't think there's a mandate to weaponize enforcement, to create new laws and force actions that are not required by regulation. EPA and state enforcement of actual regulatory requirements is critical to protect air, land, and water, and to maintain our environmental progress. At the same time, enforcement is not a numbers game. The goal is compliance with the law to protect public health and the environment, not a target number of actions or on-site inspections. And I have to say, here in 2020, we have a lot more tools to ensure compliance than 10 or even 4 years ago. EPA can advance compliance while holding violators accountable. In 2018, we reversed the downward trend in new criminal cases that had begun in 2011. And by September of this year, the Trump administration had collected more in civil and criminal penalties than in the first term of the last administration. And that's without including the 2017 Volkswagen cases. In fact, we're on track to collect more than double by the end of this year. So I hope that the next administration continues to focus on carrying out its statutory responsibilities to protect the land, air, and water where Americans live, work, and play, and that is the vision for EPA in the next 50 years. So now I would like to turn it over to Professor Heinzerling.
Thanks so much. The title of this panel suggests the possibility that EPA's first 50 years have been a time of regulatory overreach. The implicit suggestion is that the agency has regularly gone past the limit of its legal authority and has provided too much environmental protection at too great a cost. I disagree with this premise. In fact, as I see it, EPA's first 50 years have been more marred by the agency's consistent tendency to underreach than by any tendency to overreach. The agency has underreached both in comparison to its broad statutory powers and in comparison to the scale of our environmental problems. Nowhere is EPA's undershooting of these marks more pronounced and dangerous than in the agency's response to the threats posed by climate change. Next month, we'll celebrate EPA's 50th birthday. The Clean Air Act was passed in that same year. For most or all of these years, as the Supreme Court confirmed in Massachusetts versus EPA, EPA has had authority to regulate greenhouse gases as air pollutants under the statute. And as the court held in Massachusetts versus EPA, EPA's regulatory authority was so plain on the face of the statute that EPA had no power to claim that it had no power to regulate greenhouse gases. Moreover, for all of EPA's 50 years, we've had reason to believe or to suspect that greenhouse gases emitted through human activity will contribute to global warming. For well over half of those 50 years, we've had strong scientific evidence and consensus that the process of global warming is underway and that its effects will be dire. One famous and important moment came all the way back in 1988. EPA was only a teenager then, when the esteemed NASA scientist James Hansen testified in Congress that the greenhouse gas effect has been detected and is changing our climate now. Yet it was another quarter of a century before EPA formally found that greenhouse gases are endangering public health and welfare, and before it committed to doing something about it. Then, over several years, EPA managed to issue regulations for several categories of greenhouse gas emitting sources. But even in those years, EPA did not act on a scale commensurate with its statutory powers. And even in those years, EPA did not regulate on a scale commensurate with the environmental threat. Yet even that relatively modest beginning was undone by the current administration, which unregulated as fast as humanly possible, and went so far as to shun the very phrase climate change at some agencies. The sitting administration has now completed some 125 environmental rollbacks, with about 40 still in the works. Many of these decisions specifically relate to climate change. Many have gotten into legal trouble. In fact, this administration has had a notably poor record of defending its administrative decisions in the courts. A recent tally reports that in environmental cases, the administration has, despite the leeway given to agencies on legal and factual judgments, lost 37 times and prevailed 17. We've lately seen, in other words, an EPA that has overreached by underreaching. And it is even now attempting to make underreaching official agency policy. 2 examples. The White House is now reviewing a final EPA rule that would limit the scientific studies the agency may rely upon in making regulatory decisions and significant scientific determinations. Second, the White House is also reviewing a final EPA rule that would require the agency to conduct cost-benefit analyses for significant Clean Air Act rules, and in presenting the results of those analyses to highlight the health and welfare benefits that pertain to the specific objective of the provision under which the rule is promulgated, thus perhaps occluding the full range of salutary consequences that come from measures to control pollution. Thus, with a new presidential transition almost upon us, we face the possibility of a presidential term in which EPA's chief occupation may be simply undoing the destructive work done by the outgoing administration. Even merely returning to where we were 4 years ago, let alone advancing to the level of regulatory ambition we need, could take years. And those are years we don't have to lose, given the short time frame we have for effective action to guard against the most extreme effects of climate change. The example of climate change shows the environmental peril we face when we task EPA with doing too much with too few resources, and excoriate it endlessly for doing what it so plainly is not doing, that is, overreaching by overprotecting us from environmental threats. I fear that in the coming years, in a new administration, we'll see legal developments that will even more strongly encourage underreaching by this important agency. Even before the arrival of Justice Barrett, 5 justices on the Supreme Court had already signaled they were ready to begin enforcing the non-delegation principle, or the idea that Congress may not delegate its legislative powers to other entities. These justices signaled that they would revive the non-delegation doctrine, where Congress delegates major regulatory choices to executive agencies. In the context of statutory interpretation, most of these justices have already joined decisions indicating that regulatory choices about climate change are major policy choices, thus perhaps signaling that they may regard them as major policy decisions subject to their new principles for non-delegation. In his dissent in the recent non-delegation case of Gundy versus United States, Justice Gorsuch conspicuously omitted a major Clean Air Act decision, American Trucking Association versus Whitman, from his catalog of prior cases that would easily pass muster under his new test for non-delegation. For me, then, the major worry isn't that EPA will do too much when it comes to climate change or environmental problems generally. Doing too much isn't generally what EPA has done. The worry instead is that it will do too little, or that the courts will force it into that position. I'll now turn to Mr. Fulton for his remarks.
Thank you, Lisa, and good greetings, everyone. And it's really nice for me to be with my fellow panelists. All these folks are folks I've had a chance to work with along the way, great minds and thinkers. Just a brief introduction to the Environmental Law Institute for those of you who are unfamiliar with it. This is a 50-year-old organization by design, nonpartisan and non-advocacy in nature, focused on building effective governance and rule of law in the environmental space. We're, among other things, a membership organization with a broad private-public constituency. A couple of years ago, we undertook a project on cooperative federalism in memory of a departed colleague, Angus Macbeth. Many of you know him. We did this with the support of the American College of Environmental Lawyers and in cooperation with the Environmental Council of States. I thought I would use my opening time to talk a bit about the Macbeth project, as it may help us in our thinking about options in the divided leadership scenario in Washington that we are anticipating. We began this project by bringing together a group of current and former state and federal environmental officials for a series of Chatham House Rules discussions about the federal-state relationship. A good number of these folks had worn both state and federal hats. This was followed by dialogues with a broader array of stakeholders and some rather extensive surveying. This all culminated in the Macbeth report, right about 2 years old now. But in my view, still one of the more thoughtful pieces on cooperative environmental federalism that has been rendered. You can find it for free on the ELI website. The report naturally does a download on the discussion series and the surveying work, but also points in the direction of some possible reframing opportunities. As the report reflects, there was considerable support in the surveyed community for giving states greater flexibility in running delegated environmental programs. Over 70% of those surveyed felt that the federal government should defer, where states are in a position to do a better or as good a job. And over 50% of respondents felt that EPA intervention in delegated states should be limited to circumstances of clear failure or when a state has devoted inadequate resources to the endeavor. But even enthusiasts for greater state primacy consistently agreed that EPA must continue its leading role in developing national standards and conducting scientific research, as states often lack the needed expertise and sometimes the breadth of interest to play these roles. There was also a strong consensus around a relatively greater federal role in the context of interstate issues and unique federal interests. The report pointed to some places to look for options for adjustment or realignment. Let me just mention a few. First, it recommends rather strongly a return to first principles. If federal presence is premised on the Commerce Clause, let's look at any additional reframing on this basis. For issues that are inherently interstate in nature, such that the federal interest is particularly robust, this should also perhaps be the place for a greater federal role. Conversely, where issues do not have interstate dimensions, perhaps state primacy should be strongest there. This notion of a diminished federal presence relative to programs that are inherently intrastate in nature is not a small reorientation, as EPA has remained substantially involved in some programs that at this point in history are primarily intrastate in character. Examples of these include the Leaking Underground Storage Tank program, waste management regulation under RCRA, or at least the treatment, disposal, and storage facility regulation, Safe Drinking Water Act implementation, and yes, even Superfund. Some of this tendency to remain involved in intrastate matters is the function of the once you build it, it lives forever phenomenon. But I think perhaps another reason EPA has remained invested in these programs is that they can provide a sense of connection with communities, which the agency has seen as helpful in terms of engendering public support. But the report suggests that federal primacy in the context of intrastate matters is very difficult to square with the principled approach to federalism, just as it observes that with respect to interstate matters, the imperative for federal involvement is more pronounced. A key caveat on this interstate-intrastate divide is the lesson from the Flint, Michigan lead and drinking water crisis. The issue there, provision of drinking water, can be seen as intrastate in nature. And EPA attempted to be deferential, but ultimately was unable to defer in the face of state failure leading to a public health crisis. So I think that the teaching there is, as long as residual federal authority exists, there will likely also be a need for a reserved, meaningful intervention capacity for dealing with such failures. Recognizing the importance of the interstate dimension in defining the federal role, the report recommends that a formal structure be created to give downwind, downstream states a more meaningful voice in regulatory decision-making, so that self-protective states can serve as a more important check on underperforming states, perhaps decreasing the need for federal oversight. The report also considered the role that evolving monitoring technology and environmental big data will play going forward, both as a driver of environmental behaviors and also as part of the accountability system. So, for example, the advent of sophisticated fence line monitoring systems would seem to allow for considerably more within the plant flexibility. And the more operational flexibility for regulated entities, arguably the fewer friction points between levels of government. Similarly, enhancements in ambient environmental monitoring from space to ground level promise to shine a much brighter light on problematic environmental conditions and on government failures. So might this allow for some redesign of the checks and balances that have defined cooperative federalism thus far? This gives you a bit of a flavor. There's considerably more there in the report. Please give it a read. I'll wrap up my remarks so that we can hear from Hank and move on to the discussion. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Hank Havoc.
Thank you very much, Scott. One of the best decisions I made as a wet behind the ears appointee many years ago was to hire Scott into the Justice Department. That helped us a great deal as we started with this crazy Superfund program. Well, I'm honored to be on this panel. I had a chance to look at a recent FedSoc analysis of Federalist paper #1 on the importance of civil discourse, and this is an important time for that. And so far, this panel has had some disagreements already, but is civil, and I hope to keep that pattern up. So, just to give you a little context, I'm I guess the graybeard here, so I'm going to give a little bit of historical context. I've been involved in the environmental debate since Ronald Reagan was elected president and was involved in that transition. And I had the honor to work for both William French Smith and Ed Meese at the Justice Department. And I stole a line from Bill Smith that he used to describe Attorney General, but I said being an environmental appointee in a Republican administration was like being the captain of the javelin team who elected to receive. And one of my early responsibilities was to go to John Dingell and explain to him why one federal executive agency couldn't go into federal court and sue another federal executive agency, citing the unitary executive, which is now a popular concept. And that was a fun hearing. Anyway, but it was a great experience. In fact, I realized that it's been 27 years since I ended my tenure at EPA, and it seems much fresher than that. And there's two reasons for that. One is that EPA is populated, as Susan indicated, by overall by very highly qualified, competent professionals, and we're dealing then and deal now with issues of important first impression for the country. Second, it's fresh because some of the biggest issues we dealt with back then are the same issues that exist today. Back in 1990, there was a discussion about the imperative for EPA to figure out how to move beyond purely a role of command and control, regulation and enforcement because of the complexity of the emerging environmental issues. Well, here we are today and we're still working on that. So what I want to do is just make a few broad observations of some of the threads that have been woven through the last 50 years and still exist today. And then throw out some ideas about a path forward and open it up for discussion. So first observation, EPA is the story of an effort by democratic institutions and ultimately we the people to figure out how to reconcile the risks that emerge from economic and technological growth with other important social values, ranging from obviously present and future generations' health, equal justice for all, and property rights. A challenge. Congress's role has been mixed, but obviously critically important. I think EPA has been given a patchwork of sometimes unconnected environmental laws over the years, multiple oversight committees, and limited resources to implement those laws. So that's been a challenge, but in the early days, the gross categories of pollution in the major media were agreed to be significant priorities, and EPA in the states, as Susan said, did a brilliant job of really reducing those risks. I think the question now is, if the laws are not updated, it's very hard for Congress, and Congress, I'm sure one of the things they least like to do, probably to some of them, it's like getting a root canal, is to actually go back and revisit some of these environmental laws and update them. So assuming the laws are not updated, we do run the risk of inertia taking over a bit at EPA, where a lot of resources are devoted to risks that used to be significant, but are not as significant as they used to be, and maybe not have enough resources focused on emerging risks that are important. And that's something we've all dealt with for 25 plus years. A fourth observation is that science is the centerpiece of decisions to intervene in the marketplace with regard to this reconciliation of progress and protecting other important social values. Science has to be the centerpiece. I've always said scientists have to be involved early in the policy development process and defining the issues, and all the way through the policy development process to the decisions. But science is not the final decision maker. Decision makers are the Article 1 and Article 2 branches of government that have to balance all these social needs. And we've seen that debate in spades with regard to COVID, but it's very important. Science is essential, but not the last word. And I think Congress has been less than clear in the way they've written these laws. They've been results of legislative compromise. There's often vague language. There's often unrealistic deadlines. And that's something we just have to recognize. So what does this all mean going forward? I think, as I said, science is essential, but science has to be described and communicated in a way that's accurate and candid. Because as we know, with certain environmental risks, we have lots of data and important information. In other areas, we use complex models that have many default assumptions because we don't have a lot of data. That doesn't mean we don't make decisions, but we have to be as candid as possible about how that works, about how that's communicated. And we tried with a guidance in 1992 on risk characterization to achieve that goal. So two examples, one is lead. Lead was an example of an environmental contaminant where there was amazing agreement. There was a lot of epidemiological data, amazing agreement on the importance of lead as an environmental risk. And we aggressively, and EPA and society, supported going after lead aggressively. And I spent a lot of time on the lead and copper drinking water rule, which has been in place for a while. It should be updated, but in fact worked very well until there were people who didn't implement it properly. But another example from that time was electromagnetic fields. There was also a lot of interest in regulating electromagnetic fields from, for example, from this new device, the cell phone back then. And was an important issue, but in that case, there was very early emerging and unclear scientific data and not a legislative authorization to deal with it. So those were two examples of important issues that EPA needed to address, but had, for various reasons, to address, in different ways. So I think that's an important part of how we go forward. I think the bottom line is we don't have the resources or the ability to rewrite all the environmental laws right now, but I do think we have an opportunity, and when we deal with really important emerging issues, to take fresh approaches with regard to how we deal with it. And let me just, so the issues of the 21st century, there's some very major issues. Let me mention two that I think are really important. First is the impact of development on resources, which are primarily felt at the local level. And, as the judge said, my passion is water. So I focus a lot on the impact of development, as well as climate change and other things, on water resources, which is quintessentially a local kind of issue. So there's a great opportunity for the kind of cooperative federalism Scott talked about. I've seen communities and states do amazing work in really mapping out sometimes the next 100 years or the next 50 years, and mapping out water resources and what they see as risks and how they need to deal with it, and reconcile that with the economic development priorities that they all have. So that's exciting and important. There is a critical role for EPA to play, not only through SRF and other water-related programs, but also to design innovative ways to collaborate between the two, among all the levels of government. A second major issue that Lisa talked about is climate change, and I happily will not delve into the details of climate change, other than to say it's an issue that we have to address. It's an issue where that EPA should not shoulder on its own, or feel that it needs to shoulder on its own. EPA, you can talk about legislative authority, but this is an issue that quintessentially Congress has to address. As I was thinking about the role of science in all of this, the example of a physician came to mind. If a physician sees hard evidence that someone has stage 4 cancer, there's no question that immediate and radical action needs to be taken. In the case, if there are evidence of disturbing trends, whether it's with cardiovascular health or cancer, lifestyle changes are indicated. There's a lot of things that need to be done, and monitoring needs to occur, but not necessarily radical action. And I think with environmental issues, hopefully EPA and the Congress and the democratically elected branches of government can begin to focus on strategies so that it's not all or nothing, that we have to be able to use science, have dialogue, and have all the levels of government really work together on figuring out, okay, this is an urgent problem that requires immediate action, and let's get together and get that done. And EPA is very good at that. Or here's something that is a significant risk that we need to address through incremental and forward progress, but not and monitor it, and use our enormous abilities to map and track progress, and focus on monitoring and then making changes and ramping up strategies as that's indicated. So easier said than done, but I think EPA is equipped to do it. I think we all, public is a lot more sophisticated on these issues, and these issues go fundamentally to how we grow going forward. So going forward, again, I would just say the importance is the focus on science, as I've discussed, like the good physician. I would say number 2, really focus regionally much more than we ever have before, because the clusters of communities in regional parts of the world and in watersheds and things like that are really going to be the theater where so much action needs to be taken and where we need to do better. Third, Congress just needs to step up, and address these issues, and not complain if they don't update the laws and they don't like what EPA does. They need to step up, because I think by not taking action, EPA is variously viewed as either being weak or being a rogue fourth branch of government bent on world domination. Obviously, neither is the case. And the private and technology sectors finally need to be woven into this strategy, as we all know, because the economic and technological progress that required the formation of EPA also has the seed of the solutions to the problems that we have. So I'll stop there. It's a piece of cake, but I really appreciate just being part of this, and I'll send it back to our moderator, Judge Van Dyke.
Thank you, Hank. I really thank you to all of the panelists. What a great group of panelists here. We have so much experience in this area represented. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go back to the panelists, I think, in the same order. And hopefully, as Hank said, it's been a very civil group, and that's good. But we don't want to be too civil. We have to have some disagreement. So hopefully, we've got a few things we disagree on. So we'll go back through in the order that we've all already presented. But I'll add one thing that you can discuss. If you can't find anything to disagree on, feel free to opine on. Since something I care about now in this role is what is one thing one specific thing that the courts have done right in this area, and what's one specific thing that the courts have done wrong. So I guess if you find plenty to disagree with your colleagues, you don't have to address that. But if you don't find something, then you have to address that. So Susan, why don't you kick that off?
Thank you, Judge. Well, the courts are right when they hold EPA or any federal agency to its statutory authorities. I mean, you mentioned from my bio, I've worked for both House and Senate. I spent nearly 14 years of my career working for Congress, drafting legislation. And it is, I think it's tremendously important to stay within the authorizations because as Hank pointed out, these are compromises. Every piece of legislation is a compromise. And that compromise reflects the balance that has been discussed here today, balance of competing interests. And so you really can't, it is important for courts to hold agencies accountable to staying within their authorities. I'll turn it over or turn it back to you, Judge, or turn it.
Well, yeah.
Explain themselves, really making them speak in reasoned terms, having their reasons make sense, and having the reasons they give be the real reasons. I think that principle of administrative law is fundamental to environmental protection. I think it keeps agencies in line with the evidence in front of them. And I think it gives the public a sense about why this agency is working. I think it actually also leads to much greater accountability on the part of the administrative agency. So I think the thing the courts get right time and again is making agencies explain themselves. And I'll note, I will like this principle in the new administration as well, which will have to take time in order to undo any of the policies they disagree with. And that will be a result of having to explain themselves. So I actually embrace this principle across administrations. Can I just say a couple of things about the remarks on the panel?
Yes, absolutely.
I actually agreed with a ton of what was said here. And I saw one common theme among the other speakers that may not be obvious, but this is what I saw. And there's kind of the idea that in order to do its work, especially everybody agreed that EPA doesn't have the resources it needs to do all the jobs it's been assigned. And so one of the things I think EPA needs to be able to do and do reasonably and consistent with scientific evidence and so forth is take things off its agenda, as well as putting things on the agenda. And I took that to be part of your point, Susan, with respect to climate versus other issues, and Scott's point with respect to local versus federal issues, and Hank's point as well about inertia in a way, not just keeping programs because we've always had them. I think this is critical. I thought this was when I was at APA, the way you make room for the really important stuff is not to do some things. And so I thought that was a great sort of theme in all of this. The last thing I would simply say is that Hank rightly says that Congress needs to step up. I do agree. I also happen to think that Congress has stepped up time and again We have very broad statutes that give a great deal of authority to the agency. Those statutes are still in existence. And I would say a common theme of those statutes is, Hank, exactly as you say, which is to pay attention to science, really rely on science as a backbone of the agency, and then to respond to that as new and emerging science indicates that there are threats when we didn't see them before. And so to me, we need to both think what would be good action from Congress at this time on new problems, but also not minimize the extent to which Congress has already made a series of judgments in existing law that can be acted upon right now.
Thank you, Lisa. So Scott, do you have any thoughts?
Maybe just a few on the question of what the courts have gotten right and gotten wrong. I think I actually have a fair amount of faith in the judiciary, and I think on the whole, more right decisions have been made than wrong decisions. But I will observe as a sort of a stark outlier in that the Supreme Court's work and the Rapanos decision and the complete confusion that has pervaded around federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act in the years since, which has, of course, led to this progression of efforts to deal with that. The Obama administration's WOTUS rule, which has now been superseded by the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. This is a messy area, and I think it's been made more messy by the court's work on it, unfortunately. And I would guess that they would agree with that. If they had another pass at this, they would try to be a little bit clearer about that. And I'll just say that as maybe a contrarian point on this in terms of the Trump administration's work, my disappointment with the Navigable Waters Protection Rule centers around principally the question of federal leadership and kind of pointing to the problems that we need to be trying to address or not pointing to the problems. We have a big issue in this country with the graded freshwater systems as part of what Hank is working on now. A lot of that degradation now associates not so much with industrial discharges, but stormwater runoff. A lot of that contribution is from agriculture. We don't have the regulatory tools to really wrap our arms around that. But we also have this interesting political dynamic that is set up where half of the states in the union, and this really needs to be understood, half the states in the union have defined their own jurisdictional reach as coextensive with federal jurisdiction. So if you narrow federal jurisdiction, half the states are not in a position to pick up the slack. So this notion that the states are going to be the backup on all this and that they're going to be the answer to dealing with our freshwater issues in this country is just, it's not sound. And so my disappointment with that rule kind of connects with its with that sort of point of departure, if you will. I am not fatalistic about the role of the Congress and taking on some of the things that we've been talking about. Although I do think, given the constellation of actors that we're expecting, that environmental legislation will have to be centrist in nature in order to be able to be workable. But there are some things that might be workable. Perhaps there's something on the climate front, especially if we think about a carbon tax or a sort of simple approach that relies heavily on the market to kind of drive the desired behaviors. Maybe that, particularly with some members of Congress who were more favorably disposed towards climate legislation before they kind of attached their wagon decisively to the White House might be able to see these issues in a slightly different light. Maybe that's a place. RCRA, I wonder about RCRA and the fact that we have a statute that hasn't been updated in a long time that is arguably at tension with circular economy notions and modern notions about sustainability. We need to be moving much more secondary material in the direction of reuse and recycling. And RCRA, just because of its dynamics, commits a large amount of material to a destruction fate. And we're not in the right place on that. And it may be that a bipartisan solution could be derived in that space. Some other thoughts, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Scott. And Hank, we're going to turn to you. Scott talked a lot about water, which is sort of an area that's near and dear to your heart. So did he say anything that you disagree with? Do you regret hiring him all those years ago? Or anybody else? Do you have any thoughts on what anybody else said?
No, I still like to bask in Scott's reflected glow. So no, I don't regret that hiring him, even though we don't always necessarily agree. So I had two categories of only maybe marginally connected thoughts. You know, one thing that, as I was thinking about these remarks, kind of bringing up sort of an oldie but goodie, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. And, you know, I had thought for some time that even though the National Environmental Policy Act has been the subject of all kinds of crazy litigation that, you know, regarding federal projects and things like that, that there are fundamental principles in the National Environmental Policy Act that are really valuable in terms of looking at how EPA functions and how we as a society deal with these environmental challenges, because it's fundamentally focused on the record, on disclosure of the facts, on really engaging stakeholders and the public in an effective way. And a lot of this is in the EPA bailiwick as well. But there's some principles there. And so here's how I will connect it to Scott's comments, because, you know, the Waters of the United States issue, whether prairie potholes or waters of the United States, was an issue, you know, way back when we were at both Justice and EPA. It's a very tough set of issues, and this is one of those issues in which I think the courts need to hold Congress's feet to the fire, if you will, because when you get beyond navigable waters, I think there are very important policy decisions and allocations of authority from the federal, state, and local levels that are really important here. And I don't have a specific critique of the current rule or the Obama rule, other than to say that it shows, you know, how consequential that rule is and how much it not only affects economics, but it affects everybody's perception of the role and the freedom and the ability of local jurisdictions to manage growth and manage their economic affairs going forward. So that is the kind of issue that the scientists and the members of Congress and the policy experts need to get together and figure out a true bipartisan challenge. But it is important because it comes back to this issue that I mentioned briefly earlier, which is I really see the region, whether you call it a watershed, so not just the community, but a region of the country, as being a critical theater for figuring out where we go from here. And that's especially true with water resources. So I do think, you know, this endeavor that, and actually Brent Fuel, who many of you know, and I and some other experts are involved in this water finance exchange. It's really designed to work with communities in regions and figure out, you know, what works and what's keeping them from getting their water infrastructure funded. And as we do this, we see that at the regional level, you know, several activities, power, water, and broadband are essential to the economic health and vitality of those regions. And so EPA, as well as other agencies, have a really critical role to play. And I think it'll be a good balancing act, but really an important one for us to figure out how the federal government not only tells the regions what to do, but supports the regions as they try to answer these questions and make some decisions for themselves, and not intervene unless there's a compelling reason to intervene. Back to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Hank, and thank you again to all my panelists. So for the audience, we're now going to go to a question and answer period. Before we do that, though, I've been told that this is the point where I give out the super secret CLE password that you've all been waiting for, which is NLC 20. That's NLC 20. And so with that, I think you can get CLE credit. And we are watching the attendees number. And if a bunch of you drop off now, we'll be super disappointed because then you're only here for the CLE. So what we're going to do is to open it up for questions. We're going to ask you first of all, we're only taking questions over the Zoom platform. And so the way to ask questions is through Zoom. The way you do that is I ask you to raise your hand using the raise hand function on Zoom, which should be in your lower middle screen. That will let us know that you've got a question for either the panel, the whole panel, or one of the panelists. And if you're on telephone, I guess you can dial *9, and that will also allow you to ask a question and let us know that you want to ask a question. And I'll say when you do ask a question, please, if it's to one of the panelists, let us know which panelist you're asking the question to, and of course we'll let any of the panelists address it, but that panelist first. And then also ask that any questions be questions and not just some long discussion, but that they'll have a question mark at the end of them and hopefully not too terrible long. So we'll turn it over for questions on from the audience. Go ahead and press the raise hand button and I'll call on you. All right, I think we've got one here. So our first question is from Roscoe Stovall. Roscoe, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for you to ask a question. And if you're, make sure you unmute. If you're mute when you start, you have to push the unmute button so that we can hear you. Go ahead and unmute, Roscoe. Looks like you're still muted. There you go. Oh, now you're muted again.
It appears that I'm still muted.
Nope, you're unmuted now. Fire away.
Still muted.
Nope, you're good, Roscoe. We can hear you. We can hear you. Roscoe, we can hear you now.
Does this work?
Yep, that's working great. Go ahead and ask your question.
Great. I'll take my headset off. Sorry about that. Sorry to delay everybody. Okay, so thanks, Dean Van Dyke. Judge Havoc, I guess I would ask you of this, that you are actually last on the screen, and I think I'd really love to hear from you. And then I'd also like to hear from Ms. Bodine. I think the two of you would really, I'd like to hear both of you talk about what effect the Paris Accords will have should Vice President Biden actually be inaugurated and carry out his statement that he will sign early on in his administration the Paris Accords. What effect will that have, and what do you see as follow-on effects potentially?
So why don't we start, Hank? Why don't you go ahead? Thank you, Roscoe, very much. Great question.
Thank you so much.
And then Susan, and then we'll open it up to the other panelists if they've got any thoughts on that.
Sure, I'll be happy to lateral this to Susan pretty quickly, but let me start by saying that, you know, I've cared a lot about climate change, about the debate. I've been particularly focused, especially over the last, I don't know, probably 10 or 20 years, on the solutions, on the technologies and the solutions that mitigate greenhouse gases, and increasingly recently on the adaptation side of things, because obviously we can't either we can't get out of this by mitigation alone, as we all know, and adaptation is a key part of this, and it implicates so many things, which is why this is bigger than just an EPA issue. As far as the Paris Accord goes, you know, we were involved with Bush 41 and the signing of the Framework Convention, the original Framework Convention on Climate Change, and this is an issue that fundamentally the U.S. needs to participate in the international community on. The question is, what kind of commitments are made, what kind of enforcement mechanisms exist, and that sort of thing. And I'm not an expert on the Paris Climate Accord. I do believe that the United States just has to be more of an active player. First of all, because we have a lot of solutions that have global application and can have great economic impact, but also just like with another issue I work on, which is water and sanitation, in emerging markets. The U.S. has so much to bring to bear. I think it's a great way for us to build our stature and our friendships around the world. But I also think that, you know, what happens in other countries, you know, we can't solve climate by ourselves, and what happens in other countries is critical, and we need to have some influence in that process. So not knowing the nuances of Paris, I'll stop there and turn it over to Susan.
Thank you, Hank.
All yours.
So the Paris Accord was never submitted to the Senate as a treaty for ratification. So as a legal matter, it was a statement of policy. So it doesn't have an enforcement mechanism, in fact. And so, you know, the next administration could rejoin the Paris Accord, again, as a policy statement. They can propose legislation in Congress. Again, that's any administration's prerogative. But it is not self-implementing, and again, it doesn't even have the status of treaty. So I know that, you know, when the issue had been debated in Congress, I believe it was Janet McCabe testified to saying, you know, when asked, well, wait a minute, what's the purpose here? Why are we joining this, especially if we're going to bear such, you know, the costs that might be borne in the United States? The response was that we need to send a message. And then the question, of course, came back to Ms. McCabe was, well, aren't there less expensive ways of sending a message? So again, it'll be hotly debated, I'm sure, once again. But again, it's important to remember that it's not even a treaty. So does rejoining the Paris Accord do anything more than send a message? I don't believe so.
Lisa, I gotta hope that you've got a view on this, so I want to turn it over to Lisa, and then we'll see if Scott has some thoughts on it.
It's just interesting if one takes your view, Susan. Then I'm interested in the Trump administration's very deep desire to depart from something if you think it's simply a statement and symbolic and so forth. I also wonder, even if it is symbolic, what message leaving that agreement sent to the world. And here I'd be with Hank about it, the importance of our joining these global partnerships on a global problem. I agree that this is fundamentally a global problem, so that I think that rejoining makes a great deal of difference with respect to our standing in the world, our ability to influence the process. I will say that when I was a climate advisor to Lisa Jackson, I was just so struck by the amount of expertise and experience EPA brought to bear on those climate meetings, international climate meetings. And what a shame it is if the world's deprived of EPA's amazing expertise and experience.
So as I said, it is a policy statement, and the concern with the Paris Accords as drafted was that it was not fair to the United States. And so yes, climate change is a global issue. Yes, it's an issue that must be addressed, but that was not, in terms of treating the issue with respect to Americans and then across the world, that was not a policy statement that the administration embraced, and yes, withdrew from the Paris Accords.
Anything else, Lisa? All righty, Scott.
I guess I would agree with various parts of what the different factions have said. On one hand, it is certainly true that the Paris Agreement would not have immediate domestic effect if the United States were to re-sign, or is going to re-sign, as the president-elect has said he's going to. It's no accident that the assurances that are provided under the Paris Agreement are described as contributions rather than commitments. They were by design intended not to be enforceable. But despite its character, it's important to remember that Paris Agreement would not have happened but for the US-China Accord on greenhouse gases. And the Paris Agreement represents the best statement that could be hammered out between the United States and China, which then served as a predicate for what could be asked of other countries. The United States' absence from the Paris Agreement is significant in terms of the pull and sense of imperative that is projected to other countries. So I don't think it's the fact that it's not an enforceable agreement does not, in my view, mean that it's an unimportant agreement. I actually think it's an extremely important agreement, and the United States leadership and interests will be advanced by signing back up to that agreement.
Well, thank you, Scott. Does anybody else have any follow-up comments, or should we go to the next question? Seeing no hands, we'll go to Mr. Freeman, Brian Freeman. We're going to open it up for you to ask your question here. Again, remember to unmute, and I'll try to help you with that if you don't get it unmuted. But go ahead and ask your question, Brian. Let us know if it's to one particular panelist, or we can just have any of the panel.
So I'm sure can you hear?
We can hear you.
Great, thank you. Professor Heinzerling, I guess this question is mainly for you. I'm a practitioner with private practice for 30-odd years, doing a lot of air work in particular. I didn't necessarily read the panel's presentation this morning, or the setup for the panel's presentation, as implying that there was EPA overreach for 50 years, systemically, et cetera. You know, if that were the hypothesis, I wouldn't agree with it. But I have seen in practice instances where there seem to be clear instances of overreach, and this is not unique to EPA. It's a administrative phenomenon generally. But I would be interested in your thoughts on one specific instance concerning the once and always in policy, so-called, for hazardous air pollutants. That one seems to revolve off a specific grammar in the Clean Air Act, where the use of the present tense implies that a source is a major source or is not a major source, and can change from that on the hazardous air pollutant side, as well as it can do on the new source review side for non-hazardous air pollutants without controversy. But again, just for the overreach issue, though, I'm just curious, would you see that as an instance of overreach? Again, not to condemn 50 years of progress, certainly, but I'm just curious on your thoughts on that particular instance, where it seems like that's a very discrete instance of overreach.
Well, first of all, on what I said about the premise, I do take it. The title of this panel actually was a debate, but it struck me that embedded in that debate was a suggestion of the possibility of kind of a pervasive overreach by the agency, and that's the idea I was responding to, even though I fully recognize that the Federalist Society framed this, and I think it has been as a debate among us about whether that fact was true. As for the once in and always in policy under Section 112 of the Clean Air Act, you'll have to remind me about the exact specifics of that. Or I can say something generally, which is that it strikes me that in many cases, environmental law does make changes from the regulatory kind of baseline or default position difficult to do. I think there's a good reason for that. It's really hard to make any environmental progress at all, given the resources arrayed against the agency, the paucity of the agency's resources, and so forth. And so that to the extent that the statutes make regression from a regulatory baseline difficult, I wouldn't regard that as necessarily overreach.
Thank you, Lisa. Does anybody else have any thoughts on the question?
May I speak more generally?
Yeah, why don't we, Hank, why don't you go first, and then Susan.
Okay, I'll just be brief. What came to mind in that, first, I appreciate Brian's question, and having been at both Justice and EPA, there are some times when laws are implemented that presumptions are built into rules and things like that to make enforcement less difficult. And sometimes those are overreaching and sometimes they're entirely reasonable. But the comment I wanted to make, though, was, talking about the Clean Air Act, the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, which I was present for, but I can't claim much credit for, was really an amazing, I just wanted to comment that it's an amazing legislative accomplishment because I was also involved with immigration reform back in 1981. And in both cases, there are party divides as much as there are regional divides. If you look at the range of clean air issues, they're very regional issues. And so in some cases, a region might be liberal on one issue and conservative on another because of their demographics and economic base and all that. So it's an amazing accomplishment to do a comprehensive law and all the compromises that occurred to have all those titles come together when there was not a logical constituency for any one of those provisions. And so that was a great accomplishment, but it did leave room for interpretation and some challenges in implementation. But Susan's the expert on that.
And I wasn't going to speak directly to once in, always in, although again, in my opening remarks, I did say that I'm concerned about law being made through specific enforcement actions. But more broadly, the argument that I think I maybe heard Professor Heinzerling say, maybe not, that we need to let our laws, without amending them, we need to let them evolve to present and address new challenges. Again, I have to go back to what I said earlier about how each of these statutes, and Hank said the same thing, is a carefully crafted compromise. And so if you then upend that, you actually are doing a disservice to the democratic process. I mean, I've had this debate, when I was on the Hill, I had this debate with EPA staff. I remember once being briefed on a proposed rule and said, but you have no authority to do that. And the response was, but it's the right thing to do. I'm like, wait a minute, that's not your lane. And so I do think it's important for agencies to stay in their lane and then for democratic processes to work to change authority.
May I just say, I agree. We just have different views about what the environmental statutes did and what the political resolutions were, that I view them as broadly applicable statutes that support action in the face of new and emerging scientific evidence of environmental threats. It's not to say I prefer them over new legislation that's sort of a bespoke fit for the problem, but I do believe that those statutes still exert power, still are on the books. They reflect a compromise that allowed the Congress to pass a statute that gave the agency this kind of broad authority that endures over time. So I see it as completely consistent with the democratic process. And indeed, I view the idea that statutes somehow lapse after a period of time and we don't actually, the agency can't exercise its authority after a period of time. I view that as not consistent with the democratic process.
Oh, and no, I'm not aware of anyone taking that position. Clearly, the authorities don't lapse. The appropriations lapse, but the authorities don't lapse. But let me just quickly respond. I want to, if you go back to the discussion earlier, I think it was Scott talking about a definition of waters of the United States. That evolved over time without any changes to, in terms of its interpretation by the courts, without changes in statute. And then if you go back to the original debate, it is fascinating. There was an article, I think it was Wes Edelman, but an article of an interview in E&E News, I think it was June 29th, 2017, where he talked about how the staff for Senator Muskie and the Republican staff director, how they punted on, what is waters of the United States? Navigable waters means waters of the United States. And then later in a speech, I think it was Leon Billings said that the courts took it far farther than they ever imagined. So is that, I don't know. I don't know if that's democratic process or not.
Well,
I think, leaving something deliberately vague and then having it change.
Thank you, Susan. With that, I think we're going to have to wrap it up. We are out of time. First of all, I apologize to the folks that have questions that are queued up. We only have so much time, and we thank you for the great panelists, the audience questions we got. I will repeat one more time for those who may not have gotten it. The CLE password for today's session was NLC20. That's NLC20. And again, thank you. I think this is a wonderful panel with great panelists and audience participation. Reminder for the next convention event, which will be a discussion of prosecutorial discretion, partisanship, and the rule of law. That will begin, I think, in about 15 minutes at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So thank you all again. Thank you to my panelists, and everybody have a wonderful day.
Thank you.